My name is Dorothée Paulin, and I am 81 years old, and I am the last person alive who knows where my sister went. I am speaking into this recorder because my granddaughter Sylvie sat across from me at this table last Thursday and said, "Mémère, if you do not tell me now, it dies with you." And that frightened me more than I expected. I have kept this for 53 years. I kept it through the death of our mother and the death of our father and the death of every person in Noirmont who was old enough to understand what Celeste had done. I kept it through my own husband's illness and his passing, through the long winters in this house when there was nothing but the stove and the radio and the particular weight of knowing something no one else knew. I kept it because Celeste asked me to. She said, "Dottie, you are the only one who ever understood me, and you are the one I trust with this. And I need you to say nothing, not to Maman, not to Father Léveillé, not to anyone for as long as I live up there." I said I would, and she went up the mountain before the first snow of 1971, and she has not come down. She is not dead. I want that understood before anything else. She is not dead. I will tell you about the Suitors first, because that is where you have to start. Because the town of Noirmont did not understand Celeste, and the Suitors least of all, and if you do not understand why she turned them away, you cannot understand anything that came after. Noirmont sits in a fold of the Laurentian Hills, roughly 40 miles north of Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce. And in 1965, when Celeste was 24 years old, it was a town of perhaps 600 people, mostly families connected to the timber trade or to the small farms that clung to the valley floor. It had a church, a school, a hardware store that also sold flour and axle grease, and the particular social life of a place where everyone knew everything. And most things were decided by the time they reached Sunday dinner. Celeste was, by any measure the town would have applied, the most eligible woman in it. She was tall, dark-haired, with the clear grey eyes our father had and a stillness about her that people mistook for shyness. She was a licensed practical nurse and worked for old Dr. Robidoux 3 days a week out of his office on the Rue de Moulins. She was reliable and kind and competent and possessed of a quietness that men in that town seemed to interpret as waiting. She was not waiting. I knew that. But I was 5 years younger and still unmarried myself, and I watched what happened to her for 6 years before she made her choice, and I understood it better than I could say at the time. I will tell you what I mean by that, because it is important. Celeste had been different from a young age, not in a way the town could name, but in a way you felt when you were near her. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, something real in the body before the mind has a word for it. She was not strange. She was excellent at her work. She was kind to the patients old Dr. Robidoux sent to her. She kept a fine garden and cooked well and maintained the house on the Rue des Épinettes with the thoroughness our mother required. She went to Mass. She made preserves. She did everything a woman in Noirmont in 1965 was expected to do, and she did all of it with a competence that looked, from the outside, like contentment. I had grown up beside her, and I knew the difference between a person doing what they were capable of and a person doing what they were made for. When Celeste was made to work in Dr. Robidoux's office, she was precise and she was thorough, but when she went into the bush, she was something else entirely, a different quality of alertness altogether, the way a working dog is alert in the yard, and then, the moment you open a gate into a field, the whole quality of its attention changes, sharpens into something you did not know it was holding back. She knew the names of things in the forest the way she knew the names of medicines, exactly and without error. The mosses and the lichens and the particular mushrooms and which ones were safe and which were not. The behavior of creek water in spring and autumn, the signs of which animals had passed, and how recently. She had a small book she kept in her coat pocket when she walked, and in it she made notes, not descriptive notes, but precise ones, measurements and dates and what she had observed and where. I found that book in the box under the pantry floorboards, along with the bark and the stone and the feather. I have read it many times. It begins in 1962, when she was 21, and it is full of the kind of detail a scientist keeps, careful and systematic, with no room for the kind of language that would embarrass anyone who read it. What I mean is that she never wrote anything about how things made her feel. She wrote only what she saw. But I have thought about it for a long time, and I believe that in writing so carefully about what she saw, she was preserving the only record she trusted of the thing she felt, which was that the world in the high country north of Noirmont was more real to her than anything the town offered, more real and more precisely itself, and that precision was what she was always after. The first suitor was Fernand Cotet, the son of the mill owner, who came to our house in the autumn of 1964 with his hat in his hand and stayed for coffee twice before asking Papa if he might call on Celeste. Papa thought very well of Fernand. He was steady, he had prospects, he was neither unkind nor stupid. Celeste sat across the kitchen table from him and listened to him talk about the mill and the new contracts coming from Quebec City. And when he left, she stood at the window for a long time. She said, without turning around, "He talks about everything except what he sees." I said, "What do you mean, what he sees?" She said, "When he drove up tonight, the moon was exactly half. I can see it from this window. He did not say one word about it. I did not understand that then. I was 20, and it seemed to me a strange reason to turn a man away. But she turned him away, politely and without explanation, and Fernand Cotet married Yvette Marchand the following spring. And they were, from what I could see, reasonably content. Then came Denis Arsenault, who was a surveyor's assistant and therefore travelled often into the bush country north of Noirmont, and I thought that might appeal to her because she had always loved the forest. But Denis Arsenault wanted a wife who would be there when he came home, not one who came home with him, and Celeste understood this within 2 visits. She said he spoke about the forest, the way a man speaks about a field he means to clear, as a problem to be solved rather than a place to be in. After Denis came Yvon Pelletier, who taught mathematics at the school and was gentle and read books and had fine hands, and I thought surely this one. But she said, very quietly and with no unkindness, that she felt nothing when she was with him. Not displeasure, not boredom, nothing. Like a room with no window, she said. Then there was Octave Deschamps, who was 42 and a widower, and the most educated man in Noirmont, having studied in Montreal and returned to take over his father's farm after his father's heart gave out. Octave Deschamps read widely and spoke carefully, and had the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had aged into something more interesting. I liked him. My mother liked him enormously. He came to the house on 3 consecutive Sunday afternoons, and the conversations were, by any account, the most stimulating Celeste had experienced with a suitor, because he asked her questions rather than answering them, and he listened to what she said, and on the 3rd Sunday he stayed until dark, and they talked about the forest and the behaviour of water in winter, and the way certain birds moved through the valley in September, and I watched from the kitchen doorway and thought, this is the one. She turned him down a week later. She told me about it in our room, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, and she said, "He is the closest I have come. He sees things, he asks the right questions." But when I told him about the stands of old spruce north of the road, how they change the air, he nodded and said, "Yes, the old growth. It is a shame more of it has not been preserved." And that was the word that finished it. Preserved. As though what interested her about those trees was their rarity, their status as a resource, rather than the fact of what they were when you stood inside them. She looked at me across the dark of our room and said, "I'm not looking for someone who values what I love. I am looking for someone who loves what I love, and does not know why, and does not need to." I could not answer that. I have spent 53 years turning it over. There were others after that, 2 more arriving with various degrees of confidence and leaving with various degrees of bewilderment, and by 1968 the town had formed its opinion. The town's opinion was that Celeste Paulin was particular to the point of impossibility, that she had some imaginary standard no living man could meet, and that she would end her days alone in our parents' house on the Rue des Épinettes, nursing other people's children, and tending her kitchen garden, and becoming one of those women a small town holds in mild, affectionate contempt. My mother was not angry with her, but she grieved. My father said nothing, which in him meant the same thing. I watched all of this and said nothing because I had begun, by 1968, to suspect something that I did not have the words for. Something about the way Celeste moved through the world that was different from how other people moved. The way she went quiet at the edge of the tree line when we walked together. The way she stood at the kitchen window on certain evenings, not looking at anything I could see, just looking. The way she sometimes came back from her long walks north of town with mud on her boots and a particular lightness in her face that she could not quite account for. I asked her once, in the summer of 1969. I said, "Celeste, where do you go when you walk north?" She looked at me for a long moment and then she said, "Upriver." I said, "What is there?" She said, "Something I've been trying to understand for 2 years." She did not tell me more that day, but she told me in pieces over the following year, in the way that someone tells you a thing they have been carrying alone and need to set down, not all at once but a corner at a time, testing whether the floor will hold it. It had started in the autumn of 1967, she said. She had been walking the old logging road that ran north from the end of the Rue des Épinettes for about 4 miles before it dissolved into the bush. She walked it often, in all seasons, because it was quiet and because the stands of spruce up there were very old and very tall, and they changed the air, made it denser and cooler, and full of a particular smell that she could not name. On this specific evening in late October, the light was going and she was turning back, and she saw something at the edge of the road. She did not tell me at first what she saw. She said only, something very large and very still, watching me from the shadow of the spruce, and that she had been afraid, genuinely afraid for perhaps 10 seconds, and then the fear had passed as cleanly and completely as a cloud shadow passing off a field, and what remained was something she could not name either. She had gone back the next week, and the week after. She said she did not know then whether she was hoping to see it again or trying to convince herself she had imagined it. But it was there, the 3rd time. Further back in the trees, but there. And it did not move, and it did not make a sound, and eventually she turned and walked home, and the lightness she felt, she said, was the lightness of someone who has been given a piece of information they did not know they were missing. This went on for 2 years. The sightings were not regular, she said. Months might pass and she would see nothing. Then she would go north on a cold Tuesday morning and find a print in the mud along the creek bed that ran parallel to the old road. And she would know it had been near, and she would stand at the water's edge for a long time in the way she stood at the kitchen window. She had begun leaving things, she told me, a piece of dried fish she had bought at the market in Sainte Marie, a bundle of dried herbs she had put up from her garden, placed on a flat stone she had found near the creek, a stone that had the quality of a table, of a place intended for offering. She would leave the thing and walk away and not look back. And when she returned, the stone was always bare. I asked her if she was frightened, even a little. She said, "Not after the first time." She said it was the opposite of frightening, that it was the opposite of the feeling she had sitting across from Fernand Coté or Denis Arsenault or any of the others, that it was the feeling of being seen by something that did not want anything from her except her willingness to be there. I believed her. That is the thing I want to say clearly, and I want you to understand what it means for me to say it, because I am not a person who believes things easily. I was trained as a bookkeeper. I worked for 31 years at the mill office, keeping figures, and figures do not lie, but they also do not leave room for much that cannot be counted. But I believed my sister because I knew her, because I had watched her move through the world for 24 years, and I knew that she did not exaggerate and she did not romanticize, and she did not confuse what she wished for with what was true. If Celeste told me something was real, it was because she had verified it with her own eyes and measured it with the precision she brought to everything. She told me his height in the spring of 1970, when she had been close enough to him, she said, to have a sense of it. She said, somewhere around 9 feet. I do not know how she measured it. She said she stood beside the flat stone and he stood on the other side of it, maybe 15 feet back in the trees, and she compared him to the spruce behind him and made her estimate. She said his shoulders were broad beyond what she could have imagined, and his fur was the color of dark pine bark after rain, that deep wet brown that is nearly black in certain light and shows rust along the edges in others. She said his face was the part that stopped her breath, not because it was frightening, but because it was ancient, she said. That was the word she used. Ancient in a way that faces are not usually allowed to be. The brow heavy and the eyes deep-set and dark and calm, and looking at her with an attention that she recognized. She recognized it, she said, because it was the same attention she had been trying to get from every person in the town of Noirmont for years without success. It was the attention of something that was genuinely interested in what it was looking at, rather than what it might make of the thing. I sat with that for a long time. I have sat with it for 53 years. She began to learn him, she said, the way you learn any quiet being, by accumulation and patience. The sound he made sometimes, very low, a sustained note that she felt more than heard, a rumble below speech that she came to understand as acknowledgement, as greeting, because it only came when she arrived and when she left. The things she found near the flat stone sometimes that she had not left. A piece of bark shaped interestingly. A stone with an unusual weight and colour. Once a large feather she did not recognize. She kept these things in a tin box she hid under the floorboards of the back pantry. I found the box after she left. I have it still. She told me his name in November of 1970. She had given him one, she said. She said, I call him Gilles, after Papa's brother who died before I was born, the one in the photograph on the mantel. I asked her why that name. She said, because he has the same quality of stillness, and because it seemed to matter to have a name for him, for myself, if not for him. She said his name aloud to him for the first time on a late afternoon in October, when the birch trees had gone gold, and the air had that particular cold clarity it takes on in those weeks before the snow comes for good. She said she stood at the flat stone and said, Gilles, once, quietly, not as a command but as an offering, and he had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, she said, a sharper quality of attention, and he had made the low, sustained sound, but longer this time. She said, I think he understood that it was a gift. She told me she had made her decision in the winter of 1970. She told me in February, when there was 2 feet of snow on the ground and the cold was the kind that makes the house creak at night. She said, "Dottie, I'm going up in the spring." I said, "Going up where?" She said, "Up past the old logging road, into the high country. I am going to stay." I did not speak for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside the window, the spruce trees along the Rue des Epinettes stood black against a white sky. I said, "For how long?" She said, "I do not think that is the question." I did not argue with her. I want to be understood on this point, because people have told me, over the years, that I should have stopped her, that I should have told our parents, that I should have done something. I did not argue with her because I knew it would not change anything, and because I understood by February of 1971 that whatever Celeste had found up that mountain was the thing she had been looking for since before any of the suitors arrived at our door, and that it was real, and that she was not confused and she was not unwell, and that her going was not a tragedy requiring prevention. It was a life being chosen. I have believed that for 53 years, and I believe it still. I helped her prepare. That is the part nobody knows. From February through May of 1971, Celeste and I collected what she would need, quietly, in small purchases and careful accumulations so that nothing looked like what it was. She bought canvas and wool and a good quality oilcloth. She bought a handsaw and a draw knife and a hatchet she broke down from its handle and wrapped in flannel. She bought salt and dried beans and the kind of hard cheese that keeps for months in a cold cellar. She had seeds sorted and labelled in paper envelopes, things that would grow in a short season at elevation. Turnip and kale and small bush beans. She had a medical kit assembled over months from Dr. Robidoux supplies, replacing items she took so the inventory never showed a gap. She was thorough in everything she had ever done. This was no different. She had already learned, she told me, where the high ground was suitable, where the creek ran near enough to be useful, but not near enough to flood in spring, where there was enough south-facing slope to grow certain things in the short summer. She had been planning this for at least a year before she told me. She had been walking up there and looking, making notes in the small book she kept in her coat pocket, and the notes from that period are in a different hand than her earlier ones, more compressed, more purposeful, as though she had moved from observation to engineering. I asked her one evening in March what she expected. Not what she hoped, what she actually expected. She understood the distinction because she always understood my distinctions. She said, "I know that he comes near the stone. I know that he stays. I know that he has not come for the winter because the prints stop before December, and I believe he goes higher in the cold months, higher than I have been, though I have found signs of him at elevation as late as October. I know that he will come back in the spring, and I know because of the way he was in October, the way his attention was, that he will not be alarmed if I come to stay." I said, "How can you be sure of that?" She said, "I cannot be sure. I am not certain of anything. But I have thought about this for 3 years, and the only thing I am more afraid of than being wrong is the possibility of not going." I sat with that answer for the remaining weeks of winter. I did not try to change her mind, but I watched her in that period through March and into April, and she was different in a way I could not name until I had a comparison, which I found in my own much later life. In the months before I married my husband Bernard, she was the way a person is when they have made a real decision rather than a provisional one, when the question is settled and what remains is only the work of getting there. She was at peace in a way I had never seen in her. She left on a Sunday morning in May before our parents were awake. I drove her to the end of the Rue des Epinettes in the truck, her pack in the bed, and we sat for a moment at the end of the paved road where the gravel logging track began and the spruce closed over everything. It was very early, not yet fully light, and the birds were starting up in the trees, and the world smelled of mud and snowmelt and cold resin. We had not spoken much on the drive, which was normal for us because we were a family that spoke when there was something to say and otherwise kept a quiet that was its own kind of company. She said, "You will tell them I went to work in Quebec City." I said, "That will not hold for long." She said, "It does not need to hold forever, only until they are old enough that the truth won't change anything." I said, "And then what do I tell them?" She sat looking through the windshield at the place where the logging track disappeared into the trees, and the light was coming up slowly, and the birds were louder now, a particular mix of sound that only exists at dawn in spruce country, and she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell them I found what I was looking for, and I stayed because it was better than anything the town had to offer me. Tell them I am not dead and I am not lost. Tell them I chose." I said, "That is not going to satisfy Maman." She said, "No, but it is the truth, and you can give it to her or not give it to her, as you think best." "I trust your judgment." That was the only time in my life my sister ever said she trusted my judgment, and I have held it the way I held the braided grass, carefully and without wanting to change anything about it. She took my hand and held it between both of hers for perhaps 5 seconds, which, for Celeste, was a long time. Her hands were strong and cool and work-hardened. I looked at them and thought, these are hands that know what they are doing, and that is the whole thing. That is all of it. She got out of the truck. She lifted her pack from the bed with the ease of someone who had practiced the weight of it. She walked up the logging track without looking back, and the spruce swallowed her in under 2 minutes, the pack and then the dark hair, and then nothing, just the track and the trees and the birds going on exactly as before. I sat at the end of the road for a long time, long enough that the full light came and the dew began to rise off the gravel, and a red squirrel moved through the underbrush along the left side of the track and stopped to look at the truck before going on. Then I drove home and told our mother that Celeste had gone early to the bus in Sainte-Marie and would write when she was settled in the city. I told my parents, Quebec City. I told the neighbours, Quebec City. I told Father Leveille, who was suspicious and asked several probing questions, that she had taken a nursing position at a hospital there and would write when she was settled. She did not write, of course, which became its own problem in time, but by then my parents were aging and their worry about Celeste had become, I think, something they could only carry in small doses, and they stopped asking in the direct way as the years went on and simply made it part of the background of their grief, the way parents hold the corners of pain that do not resolve. The thing I could not tell anyone was that I knew she was there. Not from contact, not from any message that came down the mountain. I knew because of what I found 3 times across the years and what I came to understand those findings meant. Let me tell you about the years between her leaving and the first finding, because those years were not simple to get through. My mother's grief about Celeste was steady and quiet, and took the form of mentioning her in the same tone you use to mention weather that has not improved, not dramatically, but persistently, at the edges of conversations, at the end of meals. My father spoke of her rarely, and when he did, it was to say something practical, something about whether her nursing certificate would still be valid if she wanted to come back, whether there were positions in the city that would suit a woman with her training. He was trying to give her a door to return through, and he kept that door standing for the rest of his life, and she never came through it. I maintained the fiction of the Quebec City position with care, inventing details as needed, a rooming house near the hospital, a supervisor who appreciated her thoroughness, the expense of city living making visits difficult. I was not a person who lied easily or well, and I felt the maintenance of those details as a physical weight, heavier in some seasons than others, heaviest at Christmas, when the table had her chair empty and my mother would sometimes stop in the middle of passing a dish and look at the chair and then look away. I bore it because I had promised, and I am my father's daughter in this at least. When I say I will carry something, I carry it. The first time I went back up the road was in the autumn of 1972, about 16 months after she left. I had not walked that road since before she was gone, because I could not bear it the way you cannot bear to walk a path you walked constantly with someone who is no longer there. But something made me go that October. The same quality of late light and cold air that had been present, by her account, during so many of her own walks. A Tuesday afternoon, and the birch trees were gold, and the air had that edge to it. I had no expectation. I went only because I was tired of avoiding the road. I was maybe 2 miles up when I saw the flat stone, off to the right, where the creek ran near the road. She had described the stone to me, but I had never seen it, and I recognized it immediately, the table quality of it, the smoothness of the top, the way it sat level among all the tilted and weather-worn stones along the creek bank, as though someone had chosen it for exactly this. And on the stone there was a small bundle, neatly wrapped in a piece of oilcloth I recognized, because I had helped her choose it, a dark brown oilcloth we had found in the hardware store in Sainte Marie, and she had taken 2 yards of. The wrapping was folded precisely, the edges tucked in the way she tucked everything, the way she made a bed or wrapped a dressing. Inside the oilcloth was a carved piece of spruce, roughly 4 inches long, in the shape of something I could not immediately identify. I sat down on a log near the creek and turned it over in my hands for a long time. The work was fine, finer than I expected. The wheels were separately carved and attached with small wooden pins, and they turned. The cab had a squared roof and the approximation of a windshield. It took me, I think, several minutes to understand. It was a truck. A small, simplified truck in the proportions of the truck I had driven her to the end of the road in. The truck that had been sitting at the end of the Rue des Epinettes every day of the years she had lived at home. She had made it herself, I believe, or he had made it for her, and she had placed it there for me. I sat by the creek for a long time holding it. The water ran over its stones, and the birch leaves came down in the light, and I thought about what it meant that something on that mountain had spent time and care making a precise, small representation of the truck that had last held both of us before she walked away. The attention required to remember it, the attention required to reproduce it. I did not take it with me. I set it back on the stone and walked home and told no one. The second time was in the summer of 1979. 8 years had passed since she left, and I had made the walk up the road perhaps twice a year in that time, not always finding anything on the stone, but returning nonetheless, because the road itself had become a kind of conversation, the going and the looking and the coming back. I had married Bernard Paulin, no relation, in 1974, and I had told him almost everything. He said when I finished, "The world is more full than we knew." He said it without wonder or alarm, the way you confirm a fact you had suspected, and that was all he ever said about it, and I loved him for it. On a morning in July of 1979, I went up the road carrying nothing except a small parcel of dried apples I had prepared the previous week, without being sure why, only that it seemed like something she would have left, and I thought, if I were leaving a signal, that was the right one. The stone was bare when I arrived. I set the apples down and stood by the creek for a while, watching the water, and when I turned to go, I saw him. He was at the edge of the trees, perhaps 30 feet away, standing in the full shadow of the spruce, almost still, the way Celeste had described. He was exactly as she had said, and I want to be careful here because it is important to say it without exaggeration. He was enormous in the way that the oldest trees are enormous, not threatening, but simply of a different scale than what you are accustomed to, so that the mind spends a moment adjusting. The fur was the dark, wet brown she had described, nearly black in the shadow, and his shoulders were broad beyond what I could have anticipated even having been told. His face was in partial shadow, but his eyes were not. His eyes were dark and very calm, and they were looking at me with an attention that I can only describe as deliberate, as though he had decided to look and was carrying through with that decision, not the unfocused gaze of a wild animal alerted by movement, but something more specific and more settled than that. I stood, and he stood, and neither of us moved. I was not afraid. I want to say that as plainly as possible. I was not afraid, and the absence of fear was not bravado or composure. It was simply that what I was looking at did not produce fear, the way a very old dog does not produce fear even when it is large, because what comes from it is recognition rather than menace. He was looking at me the way something looks when it knows who you are and has been expecting you. After a time I said, without having planned to say anything, "She is well." He made the sound. The low, sustained rumble she had described, that is felt in the chest more than heard in the ears. He made it once, not loudly, not long, just once, and it was, I can tell you, the most unambiguous answer I have received to a direct question in all my 81 years. Then he turned and walked into the trees without any hurry, unhurried in the way that the very large are unhurried because the world moves at their pace rather than the reverse. And he was gone. The trees were exactly as they had been. The creek ran on. The parcel of dried apples sat on the flat stone. I stood by the creek for a long time. Then I went home and told Bernard, and he put his hand over mine at the kitchen table and nodded once, and we had our supper. And I think that was the day I stopped grieving for my sister, because I understood finally that grief was the wrong shape for what I was holding. The third time was 1988. I was 47. Bernard had been ill the previous winter, and I had gone up the road in late August, later than usual, because the summer had been taken up with his care. The stone had been bare in May. It was not bare in August. I found on it, wrapped again in oilcloth, a small length of braided grass, 3 colours woven together in a pattern that was more complex than I could have achieved myself. And I know this because I spent some time the following winter trying to reproduce it, and could not. The grass was dried but had been green when it was worked, and the 3 colours were the golden yellow of the long grass that grows in the clearings at the edge of the high country, the pale green of the sedge that grows in wet soil near the creek, and a darker strand that I believe was dyed, though I cannot say with what. The weaving was tight, and the piece held its shape the way a well-made thing holds its shape, with no loosening or fraying at the edges. It was tied at both ends with a thin strip of bark, inner bark, still supple, stripped carefully from something and cut to a uniform width. I sat on the log near the creek, which I had come to think of as mine in the way you claim a chair in a room you visit regularly, and I looked at it for a long time. It was, in its construction, as precise and intentional as anything a person might make with full use of their hands and their attention and their desire to make something worth keeping. I have thought about this for 35 years. I have thought about whose hands made it and what the making of it was like, and whether there was, in the making of it and the placing of it on the stone, some understanding that on a particular day a particular person would come up the logging road and find it there and understand that it was meant for her. I kept this one. I tucked it inside my coat and carried it home, and put it on the windowsill of our bedroom where I have kept it ever since. When Bernard died 11 years ago, I moved it from his side of the windowsill to the center, and it has been there since. I want to tell you about the town and what the town made of her leaving, because I think it matters to understand what she left behind and what she chose instead. The town, in the beginning, accepted the Quebec City story with the mild interest a small community gives to any departure. There was some talk about whether she had gone for a man, whether she had been quietly unhappy, whether she had finally found a position worthy of her abilities. Father Leveillé said a prayer for her at Mass, which I found both touching and somewhat presumptuous. The suitors in question, who had by this time all married and had children, reacted with the particular mixture of injured pride and relieved detachment that characterizes a man who believes he has been passed over. As the years passed and no letters came and no visits and no word beyond my own carefully maintained fiction of occasional news from the city, the town's story about Celeste changed. It became a cautionary tale told in the particular way small towns tell such stories, with a kind of satisfied sadness. She had been too particular, the story went. She had wanted something no real man could provide, and she had gone south chasing it and found nothing, and now she was alone in the city. And this was what came of a woman who could not be satisfied with what was offered to her. I heard this story many times, at the post office and after Mass, and once, to my considerable irritation, from my own mother, who in her old age had revised her grief about Celeste into something that looked more like vindication. I said nothing to correct it, because I had promised, and because the truth would have done no one in that town any good. The truth was that Celeste was not alone. The truth was that she had not gone south at all. The truth was that what the town had interpreted as impossible perfectionism was nothing of the kind. It was precision. It was the same quality of attention she had always brought to everything, applied at last to the central question of her life. She had looked at every man the town offered her, and she had found that none of them saw what she saw when she looked at the world, and she had walked north alone until she found something that did. I have thought about what that means for 53 years. I am still thinking about it. My granddaughter Sylvie asked me last Thursday whether I thought Celeste was happy. I told her I could not speak to happiness, which is too large a word for what I actually know. What I know is what I saw on those 3 occasions when I went up the road, and what I heard on one of them, and what I found on 2 of them. What I know is that the things she left for me were made with care, and with the specific knowledge of who I was, which required that someone in that high country remembered me and wanted to acknowledge that remembrance. What I know is that when I spoke into the shadow of the spruce trees and asked whether she was well, the answer I received was as plain and specific as any answer I have gotten from any source in my 81 years. I know she is there. I know she stayed. I know she is not coming down. The world thinks a woman who turns down every man in her town and then disappears into the mountains is a tragedy, or a cautionary tale, or a ghost story. The world has always thought that about women who chose differently from what was expected of them, and the world has always been wrong, and I have spent my whole adult life watching the world be wrong about Celeste, and holding the true version of her life inside me like a coal I will not let go cold. There are things about her life up there that I do not know. I do not know the details of how she built what she built, or how she passed the winters in those first years, or what the arrangement of her days looked like when the season was right for the garden she had planned. I do not know how they communicated across the difference between them, except that they did, because the objects on the stone and the sound in the shadow of the trees were not random, and they were not coincidence. I do not know whether she thought of home often, of our parents, of me. I hope she did, and I am prepared to believe she did because she left the things on the stone and she placed them where she knew I might find them. And that is an act of love in the specific form love takes in our family, which has never been an easy or voluble love, but has always, when it showed itself, been precise. I am not sad about her. I want to say that plainly. I have missed her every year for 53 years, and I will miss her until I die. But the missing is not the same as sorrow, and I have never once, in all those years, believed she made a wrong choice. She made the choice that was exactly right for who she was. And who she was had been evident to me, if to no one else. From the time we were children walking together in the hills behind Noirmont, when she would stop at the edge of the woods and stand there with her head slightly tilted, and I would ask her what she was listening to, and she would say she was not sure, only that there was something she needed to understand. She went up to understand it, and she stayed because she did. The tin box with the bark and the stone and the feather is in the back pantry, under the second floorboard from the wall, where she hid it, and I left it, because I did not want to move anything she had placed. The braided grass is on my windowsill. There are mornings when I stand at my kitchen window and look north, the way she used to look, and I find that I understand better now, at 81, why she stood there so long. Not because I see anything she saw, but because I know now what she was looking toward, and it seems to me the most reasonable direction a person can face. Sylvie asked me if I wanted her to go up there. I said no. I said, some things remain with the person who chose them, and the mountain is hers, and whatever is there is hers, and it is not ours to go and look. Sylvie said, but what if she needs something? I looked at my granddaughter, who is 26, and sharp and kind, and not at all like Celeste except around the eyes, and I said, if she needed something, we would know. I am stopping the recording now. What I have told you is everything I know, and I have told it exactly as I've been telling it to myself for 53 years, testing the details against each other, checking the numbers, making sure nothing in it contradicts anything else. It does not contradict. It holds. My sister Céleste Paulin walked up the logging road north of Noirmont, Quebec, in May of 1971, carrying everything she needed. She found a flat stone near a creek 4 miles into the high country and placed things on it, and found things on it in return. She chose that world over this one, not because this one wounded her or failed her, but because it was too small. And she had found something on the other side of the tree line that was not too small, that was in fact exactly the size she had always believed the world to be. And she stayed. I believe she is well. I believe the proof is on the windowsill. I believe the world is more full than any of the suitors could have told her.